I'm very excited to present our first speaker of the session, and that is Durhane Wong-Rieger. She's going to be speaking on the topic, Leave No One Behind, Multiple Pathways for Access to Transformative Therapies. First, a word about Durhane. She's president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders and of Rare Disease International. She has served on a number of health policy advisory committees and panels and is a member of the Ontario Rare Disease Implementation Working Group, Genome Canada Steering Committee for the Rare Disease Precision Health Initiative, and many others. Durhane's perspective is going to be so valuable, bringing that of patients and families. And if you don't believe me, just pick up today's Ottawa Citizen. This literally is fresh off the press for those who don't get hard copy of newspapers. Below the fold, City Baby Pioneers Rare Gene Therapy Treatment. We couldn't have asked for a better lead-in to today's session. Our good friend Alex McKenzie and others at CHEO and the University of Ottawa have been working on these issues for quite some time. We're delighted that it came at this moment. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Durhane to the symposium and to give remarks for the next 15 minutes or so. Durhane?
Thank you so very much, and huge thanks certainly to Eric and to Gairdner for the opportunity to present on what is really, for me, one of my most important topics, and that is how do we get access to therapies. And really, I think as the headline there indicates, we've got so many transformative therapies that are right here in front of us, and the challenge is how do we make them available to the patients, because no good having the therapies, obviously, if they're not going to be made available. And you're going to hear later about some of the spectacular advances that Canada is actually involved in, but also some of the ways in which we have failed in the past in getting these therapies to patients. So I'm going to start, obviously, with rare diseases. Not to say that all transformative therapies are rare disease drugs, nor are all rare disease drugs transformative therapies. But I do think that everyone will agree that the big start in terms of many of these therapies, including the technology that's behind the COVID vaccines that we're seeing right now, really a lot of them originate in the research for treatments for rare diseases. And this just gives a very quick snapshot of the timeline and the events that led to where we are now with regard to rare disease therapies, and as we say, many of the transformative therapies that are part and parcel of this. So 1983, as you can see, was the start in the U.S. with the passing of the Orphan Drug Act. And it is a fact that in the decade prior to 1983, there were only 10 new therapies for rare diseases. And since that time, there have been more than 700 drugs for rare diseases that have been approved in the U.S., about 300, 400 or so also approved in the EU. And you can see that other countries then have also adopted rare disease orphan drug legislation as they've moved forward, most notably the EU in 1999, 2000, when they passed their own Orphan Drug Act to really become sort of that second major hub in terms of research and development for rare diseases. Taiwan, South Korea, which is producing a really significant research in rare diseases now. And, Canada, I put it in there, and I sometimes put it in there with a little question mark. I think we're trying hard to figure out where our place is in terms of the research and development for rare diseases. And I think we've got a ways to go yet in terms of making sure that we're able to provide the kinds of incentives that you will see in terms of some of the research that is taking place now. So just to say that in terms of the treatments for rare diseases, there are lots of challenges for reimbursement, as we said. I mean, in part because there are obviously some huge concerns with regard to the level of evidence that comes out when these drugs are first made available, small clinical trials, short clinical trials, certainly a lot less experience with them than one might have for many of your traditional drugs. Obviously, the cost of these drugs are something to be reckoned with, and you may have heard yesterday in some of the economics around it. How do we make that happen? And then certainly some of the reimbursement strategies, really in Canada, but in many other countries, are really grounded in terms of what's the best value for money. And certainly payers are really reluctant to provide for therapies that have uncertainty. And many of these therapies will have lots of uncertainty because they are new, because this clinical trials are short, because the patient population is small. And the way in which we actually pay for therapies is actually not geared toward these kinds of transformative therapies, which may have not only high cost, but high upfront costs. And it does mean that they're very difficult in terms of being able to figure out how they fit in the budget, but also beyond that, where there's a lot of post-marketed monitoring, where patient management over long term has to be in place. And that is not necessarily even part of our system, let alone in terms of how we finance that. So just to quickly then say, transformative therapies are defined quite simply as those that are delivered through a single intervention or short course treatment, demonstrate a significant potential for substantial and sustained health benefits extending through a patient's lifetime. That's not the only definition, but it's one that fits within the context now. A real challenge, of course, is that there are differences in terms of how different stakeholders perceive them. And from a patient's point of view, in many cases, of course, this is the mecca. This is what they've been working for. And that is a treatment that's not only going to, be a one-time or a easy to manage kind of administration, but could last for a lifetime, could have that lasting benefit. We know that when we talk to clinicians, some of them are, despite their enthusiasm, are also concerned when it becomes large-scale implementation, even if it's a small population. Do we have the capacity to do that? Can we actually affect it? The health technology assessment, the cost, the economics of it, of course, are very challenging. And as we said, the impact on the payers can be quite daunting if we think about traditional methods of how do we finance this, and that is you finance them when the patients get access to the therapies. For us, the essence of how do we break out of this is going back to the basics, and that is recognizing that we really are talking about the patient. And if we keep in mind that the patients are at the center of it, that actually helps us in terms of how do we work our way through making them available, but also the patient in the center of it, not as a passive patient, but a patient that has been actively involved throughout. And what we say is that the patient who's involved in terms of the drug discovery part, and certainly around the world, there are patient organizations, patients that are making a huge impact on everything from funding the research, but also in terms of defining what the meaningful endpoint should be, so that when we're talking about assessment, we're assessing against things that are valuable to patients and actually measured in terms of what patients count as significant. When we're talking then about these clinical trials as well, making sure the clinical trials are designed in a way that patients are comfortable about participating and are able to actually take part. I mean, a gene therapy, is a significant ask for a patient in terms of a clinical trial, but also how do we make sure that we are measuring the right kinds of endpoints for patients. Involvement in the clinical and the regulatory affairs to make sure that they're assessed in a way that makes sense to patients. The health technology assessment, what are the cost benefits here that for patients, how do we make sure that we are able to measure effectiveness, not just at the point of administration, but over that lifetime value of the drug, and helping to work with regard to the payer to make sure that they're going to be available. Part of that availability is making sure that the value of the drug is actually able to be demonstrated, that patients remain involved in providing that data over that lifetime of the drug. And sometimes that can be daunting, especially if you think about a one-term administration where the patient may not necessarily need to have regular engagement with that health system, but we've got to have them involved over that period of time for the safety point, for the demonstration of benefits point. So that's, again, involving the patient community. Certainly for us, it is a huge challenge in terms of making sure then that we're getting these therapies to the right people. And part of what we do know is that so far the health technology assessment, not just in Canada, but worldwide, globally, has not been well suited to actually assessing these kinds of therapies. The methodologies that are used are actually been designed for the kinds of therapies we've had in the past, for comparing a newer, slightly improved version to an older therapy. And when you try to bring in something that is significantly different, you do not have the ability to actually be able to measure it any more than if we think about what we're doing with the vaccine for COVID right now. If you were to ask, how do we demonstrate the cost effectiveness of the kinds of investment we have to make for this vaccine, there is no way you can take a traditional measure and say, okay, I can justify the amount that we're spending. Not to say that we're wanting to spend, enormous amounts without any evidence that we're actually going to be able to get value from it, but just to say that our value assessments have got to be matched to the kinds of treatments that are coming in. Part of it is also making sure then that we are finding the right patients that are going to be getting it. And I think this is really important. The CAR T therapies have been a great example where the introduction of them have not been for the whole population, but for that small part of the population that's not been responsive to the traditional therapies, that has benefits in terms of having the highest amount of value for demonstrating value, but also for being able to manage the impact in the clinic system and also in the budget. So this has been important. And then as we talk about it, we can expand it as we keep patients engaged to be able to collect that real world data. And that's, again, part of the process for bringing these therapies in a way that makes sense. Trying to get to the next slide. Okay, here we go. So there's lots of ways in which this can be done. I'm not going to belabor this, but we've been really pleased to see that some of these transformative therapies, the systems have been able to manage very, very well. This is one for Luxturna, which is a therapy for patients who have a certain form of congenital progressive blindness. NICE was able to actually approve this therapy within their traditional system with the highly specialized technologies, with their assessments around the cost effectiveness. And what they did was to take a very, very creative view of being able to say, okay, we're going to assume that there is a lifetime benefit of 40 years. And if we measure it against that, we're able to demonstrate the cost effectiveness. We don't have data for 40 years, but we can make that assumption based on the data that we do have and the kinds of extrapolation we think are legitimate. Harvard Pilgrim, same therapy in the US, took a very different approach, of course, and they said, look, we'll set up an outcomes-based contract for this gene therapy. And what we will do then is to engage in a risk reduction and financial mitigation contract with the providers. And what we'll do is we'll make payments over a period of time. And these payments then will be based on the outcomes. And so again, two different ways of taking that same therapy, making them available to patients in a timely fashion, using some variations of the current models that we do in terms of assessing for value. And that's really very, very important. So this is what we're talking about as well in terms of a bit of a schematic. I mean, one of the things we have been able to do, and again, COVID comes very clearly into that case, how do we cut costs? How do we have fast track R&D so that the time to getting the drug from the original inception to the patient is actually as short as possible, getting it through the regulatory review. That, of course, is a huge factor in terms of the cost of the therapy, making sure that we're having the patients and the clinicians involved in the early dialogue. What are the outcome measures that are important to here? What should we be assessing against? Having, as we said, a cooperative framework for fair prices, sustainable healthcare budgets. We saw that with NICE. We see that with Harvard. We see that with some of the innovative financing methods that are coming through, not just in the US, but also in Europe as well. And keeping patients involved, because if the patients do not commit to that long-term data monitoring and reporting, we're not going to be able to have the long-term value of it, not be able to expand it. This then just looks at the same thing in a slightly different way, having involvement of the patients. But what it does say is that we're going to have to change our system then in order to match these kinds of therapies, to address the barriers that these therapies are going to create as we go through. Our health systems were not necessarily designed for this. And what we have to do then is to adapt everything from how do we do the clinical trials, how do we do the regulatory review, how do we do the financing and the clinical management. That has to change all the way through. All right, so this is then in terms of the actual requirements. One of the most important things that we want to say is that we want to make sure, of course, that they are going to be used appropriately, they get to the right patients, we have the right kind of clinical expertise to make sure it happens. This is then, as we say, huge impact throughout the system, the modifications that are already taking place. This is a patient-focused initiative, patient access to advanced medicines. The EU is really talking about the ways in which they can do it. There's a whole initiative called Rare Impact, which is engaging all the countries in the EU to talk about how can you adapt in your systems to provide the right assessment for it. So they're looking at the kinds of benefits, the evidence, uncertainty. How do we take all that into consideration? Because that's how the therapies are coming. How do we make sure they're affordable? So looking at what the actual price is, but also the funding models that'll make it happen. How do we make sure they're available, that we've got the right centers set up, the right number of centers that are linked to each other so that we don't have to have centers in every locale, which cannot happen, of course, when you think about the technology of these therapies, and making sure they're accessible to the patients. In some environments where there's significant co-pays, this is a huge effort, but also the administrative burden in terms of setting these up. So this is something that every country now in the EU engaged in this initiative is looking at, and certainly something that we in Canada need to look at as well. And this just looks at how they're doing it, gives some examples in what different locales are doing, addressing all of these issues, challenges, and the solution. Very worthwhile for us to look at, very parallel to our issues here. I would just end by saying we've got, real challenges in Canada toward orphan drugs, and I'm going to end up with something which I think is very important for us, and that is we're moving very rapidly in Canada toward the most important opportunity we have, and that is for the commitment to pan-Canadian rare drug strategy. And we're going to be launching, we've been doing webinars on it for the last 5 weeks, for the last couple months. We are launching our own consultations in collaboration with many of the agencies on December the 16th, and hope to be spending the next year towards consultations throughout Canada to hopefully come up with a proposal for a pan-Canadian rare drug program that actually can take advantage of the $1 billion that the federal government has made as a commitment to setting this up over 2 years from 2022 to 2023 with a $500 million commitment going forth each year. This is, in fact, we think the opportunity to try to get it right for certainly transformative therapies, for orphan drugs, for rare diseases, and hopefully for diseases that go way beyond just the rare diseases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Durhane. That presentation was exactly what we hoped it would be. I think we've come to the point where we probably don't have time for audience questions, but I'd like to pose a quick one for you. Could you just maybe reflect a little bit on your optimism with respect to these therapies coming in and really addressing the issues that your organization is most concerned with? How optimistic do you feel right now?
We are over the moon optimistic because this is what we've all been looking for. Every one of the patient organizations, when they get set up, the main thing they ask is certainly they want to do support and care, but what they want to say is that we want to cure the disease. And we're at the point now where we can just about cure diseases. So this is something that I think many of us were not sure would happen in our lifetime. Certainly I wasn't sure of it. And to be able to be at that cusp is amazing. And certainly for us as well, when we see what Canada is stepping up to do to be a part of this. I mean, the first gene therapy, as you know, that was ever approved in the EU came out of work that was done in Canada. The gene therapies that are really going to make a significant difference are being done globally, but we feel Canada has a huge opportunity to be a part of it. So a rare disease drug strategy that includes research and development is critical.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Durhane. That's a lovely way to finish. I want to thank you for attending the symposium. We appreciate your presentation. And we're now actually going to move forward with our next session. So thanks again, Durhane. And I know your remarks are very much appreciated by everyone.